graphics tablet system was the first Paintbox program to be licensed to Apple. As a musician, performer, producer, video artist, and interactive program designer, Todd Rundgren has a unique vision of interactive media and its future role in the entertainment industry. In keeping with the New Music Seminar's ongoing commitment to innovation and creativity in the music industry, we welcome Todd Rundgren to NMS 13.
Thank you. Got everyone here? I don't know who's more nuts for showing up this hour, you guys or me, but before we get into the substance of the program, I thought I'd start out with a cartoon, being Saturday morning. I'll give you a little brief explanation of what this is after it runs, and then we'll get on to the meat of the show here. So, here we go. Nice. Thank you. Some of you may have seen this before. Odds are most of you haven't unless you've attended a computer conference in the last year or so. That was done about a year and a half ago, actually January of 1991. The significant part about that is that it was all done on desktop computers. It wasn't done with any kind of expensive mainframe equipment. As a matter of fact, I bought all the equipment and produced the piece within what would have been a relatively slim video budget. So without getting too much into the details of that, I just wanted to point out that time marches on, technology marches on. This kind of stuff can be done by any one of you or any client of yours or something like that if you have the perspicacity to undertake such a thing. But that is not actually the subject of the talk today. The subject of the talk today is, despite the obtuse title of the lecture, is about interactive music, exactly what that is and how it can be produced and what potentially is the market for it, and also who will potentially be making such things. About a year ago or so, my 19-year-long association with Warner Brothers Records finally came to a screeching halt. And rather than go out and sign with another label, I decided that it was a good opportunity to reevaluate myself as an artist and also reevaluate the industry in general, see how I fitted into it, and decide where to go from there. And it occurred to me that I've been spending a lot of time, significant amount of time, possibly as much as I had been making music, getting up to speed on technological issues, particularly those that have to do with computers and interactivity. And it occurred to me that music has undergone this kind of enervation. You may or may not agree with me, but there was a time when I was growing up where music in itself was enough. To make a record, the first thing you had to do was be a performer and be out somewhere playing in front of people, and then you more or less earned the right to make a record by dint of your pleasing the people you played for. And then you went out and played the record that you made, and things were essentially musical. If you'll recall that seminal band of the 60s, the Beatles, if you've seen any of their tapes, it was a fairly simple affair. Of course, the screaming was so loud you could never tell whether they were actually playing or not, but they had a couple amplifiers on the stage and a little drum riser, and essentially it just stood up there and played. And that was all that was necessary. Well, as the industry matured, there started to become this sort of blurring between music and other forms of show business until by the time we got to the 80s, music had become secondary to a personality, art of the personality or personality cult as embodied by people like Madonna and Michael Jackson, which is not to demean their music, although much of it is demeanable. But the music was an adjunct to the selling of their personality. And I've never been that kind of an artist because I don't have that temperament. I can't put myself through the things that are necessary in order to market my personality. In other words, I'm not absolutely sure it's marketable in the first place. And secondly, I'm kind of like a private guy, and I don't like people, like making speculations about what I do on my own time. So essentially, I was becoming kind of like far distant from the mainstream of what people considered music business, which to my mind wasn't actually music at all. It was this selling of the personality. So I decided that since I was spending so much time with these computer things, these technological things, and that in a sense they were coming to a head because a lot of this stuff is starting to reach the consumer market now. People are becoming aware of concepts of interactivity, concepts of, quote, multimedia, although that term is abused to the extent that I hesitate to use it at all. Pardon me. And, sorry. And so I wanted to find a way to sort of integrate these and at the same time sort of get a new perspective on what I've been doing musically for a long time. And it occurred to me that it might be possible to, at least for myself and for anyone else who, who thought that this was an area of interest for them, to almost synthesize a different kind of art form out of the art that I've been working in and the new technology that would enable it to be enjoyed in a different way, or not enjoyed in a different way. And so I started developing this concept of interactive music. That is, music that is still based essentially in musical performance. A lot of people, when they think multimedia, and you'll be getting multimedia recordings, things like that, that essentially all the extra space on the disc is going to be taken up with biographical information or lyrics printed out of the stuff that you might normally find printed in the liner notes to the album. And that's not what I'm particularly interested in. I'm interested in stretching the boundaries, the experience of listening to the music to make it different. And the ultimate metaphor that I came up with was that there are art forms that are strictly linear, and music is one of those. Theater is most times one of those things, where it has a distinct beginning and an end, and the artist expects you to start at the beginning and go to the end. And that represents the experience. People have traditionally sort of tortured themselves over the running order of an album, perhaps, which song follows which song, as if this is of prime importance, really, to get the message across. And I probably at one point was one of those artists. But I started to realize that there are other art forms that have a non-linear nature. For instance, sculpture. If you're enjoying a piece of sculpture, you don't necessarily have to do it. There's no such thing as a beginning and end to a piece of sculpture. You look at it from one angle, you look at it from another angle, you look at it in different lights, you go away, look at something else, come back and look at it again, and form new opinions about it. And in that sense, it allows you, the so-called audience, to set some of the agenda about the way the art is experienced. Painting is like that, sculpture is like that. There are other art forms that in one sense are considered static, but in another sense give the audience more control over how they experience it. And I was starting to realize that now that technology has come around to give us more flexibility about the way we work with the essential data, the content that makes up the presentation, that it was possible to incorporate some of that other agenda into it. It requires, as an artist, for me to give up something, for me to give up that strict agenda, to say that it'll only be the way I say it is, and that it can potentially be the way you say it is. Beyond that, it could potentially be different every single time. In other words, it doesn't have to be the exact same experience of the musical space. In this sense, you'll notice that I'm talking about things in terms of space rather than timeline. Music no longer is a linear thing with events laying upon this particular timeline. They can be let's say, a volume of music that has hypothetically a three-dimensional or multi-dimensional aspect to it, in which you can navigate it up and down and sideways and forward and backwards and inhabit it for as long as you care to, or inhabit particular areas of it that are of interest to you. And in that sense, the music becomes more like sculpture, or becomes more like painting, in which the audience has more control over the agenda. I get a little less control over the agenda, but also it creates a really sort of radically different assessment of what the art is about. Before I get too far into I'm going to be giving a technical demonstration here of some of the work that I've been doing. But before I get too far into that, I want to cover some sort of ethical issues of this particular thing. Like what does this art form convey? How does it transfer to other media? In other words, interactivity in general. Not just interactivity in music, but interactivity in television, which is something that will be coming not too long. Interactivity in the sort of merging of all of these different media into something that is less partitioned up into music, into video, into theater, something that in which all of these things can be experienced dynamically. And I think one of the significant aspects that you have to keep in mind, one of the things that you're trying to convey to the audience is, first of all, an awareness of impermanence, an awareness of the fact that things don't always stay the same. The term that I use, or that we use in our conversations where we're talking about this general field, is called iterations. Whereas traditionally the goal has been to make something static and finite, and something that will stay the same way all the time. Instead, it's a series of going over the stuff all the time and making changes all the time. And in that sense, you want to be able to convey to the audience this sense of impermanence. This is a reality of life, that as much as we try and crystallize things, there is entropy, there is new influences, there's evolution, there's revolution. Things change all the time. You just have to sort of face that. Another thing that we want to make the audience aware of, or convey to the audience in this new art form, or this new artistic philosophy, you could say that interactivity may attain to something like impressionism or expressionism or cubism or something like that, in which it can be applied not just to a single art form but to a number of art forms. And that second aspect is an awareness of choice, an awareness in the audience that they have options, not only in terms of art but in terms of real life, and that they can be made more aware of the fact that they have options, and therefore be more conscious, careful, or carefree, as the case may be, in terms of making those choices. But they're not done unconsciously. They are done with a certain kind of volition. And the other aspect, and maybe the one that impacts in the way that artists work in something that I consider sort of a revolutionary way, is the idea of extensibility. And what that means is that rather than looking at your work as a series of single milestones, in the way that artist makes an album, and you say, okay, we write the album, then we record the album, then we release the album, and you get this 40 or 50 minutes worth of music in one chunk, that it becomes no longer necessary to do that. That you can wake up one day and decide that that your oeuvre is incomplete in some way, and add some little thing to it. some small thing to it that becomes a part of this volume that the audience can explore. At the same time, you may decide that there are parts of it that are obsolete, and so they can therefore be removed or archived from the so-called volume of content that the audience will experience. And in that sense, you have introduced a continuum to what you do, rather than saying like, okay, we go into the studio for a year or two and come up with an album, and every 2 years you surface again, have to reacquaint yourself with the audience again, have to put all of your bets on the table, because here's your career on the line once again. It takes a whole other character. It becomes just a kind of throughput of your artistic life. At any particular time that you want to add something to this, you can add something to it, and the audience can immediately take advantage of it. You may be asking, how is this all possible? There are very few interactive devices available to the public at large right now. Some people have personal computers, and personal computers are interactive, although personal computers have not been, up till now, specifically designed for the presentation of a so-called artistic experience. In other words, interactivity for someone who designs a computer is adequate if the screen only goes blank for 2 or 3 seconds while it goes down and gets information off of a storage device. In true interactivity, that's not acceptable, unless you want to accept those kind of blackouts as being part of the experience. True interactivity is a seamless throughput of the content that you want the audience to experience, and only just now are devices coming to market that allow you to do that, and in some ways they can be considered crude. But the most significant one at this particular point in time is called CDI, and that stands for CD Interactive, and it's a data storage format with a special player that you can get in Radio Shack now for about $500. And most of the software you'll find on it has nothing to do with artistic presentation. It has to do with games and informational services and stuff like that. What I would hope to do, what I expect to be doing, is early next year, when my next CD comes out, there'll also be an interactive version of it. As a matter of fact, the music is recorded to be interactive at its inception, and ultimately to be ported downward to a non-interactive platform, which is the standard CD. Now, for those of you into the economic questions there, yes, of course, you're not going to make any money doing the interactive version right now. There's this kind of like 2 pyramids. There is the interactivity pyramid, which essentially, in terms of audience penetration, is a pyramid standing on its point. Where the interactivity is greater up at the top, where you need all the most advanced technology to create the greatest bandwidth and the greatest degree of interaction, there are very few people able to enjoy that. And down at the bottom, where the interactivity is least, or going eventually to non-interactivity, the audience is largest. So whatever you do ultimately has to be able to port to a regular old record. And this has been the challenge, I think. It may not always be that way. There may come a point in which making just a regular old pedestrian record, some 10, 15, 20 years from now, is going to seem quaint. Quaint to the same extent that if a sculptor decided the only way to look at a piece of sculpture was in a certain light and from a certain angle. And so I essentially have been devoting my time to developing not only the actual content part, but methodologies and tools for presenting this stuff and trying eventually to get it onto a commercially available interactive platform. What I'd like to do now is give you a little technical demonstration of what I've been trying to do, and then I'll play you a little music, and you can kind of listen along with it and try and see if you can listen to it as if it was just a standard record, but at the same time, B, detect the navigational points in it for an interactive format. But first thing I want to do is give you a little demonstration of the tools that we use, or the tools that I'm using at this point. This is an Apple Macintosh computer. It's got 8 megs in it. It's a CI, and it's connected up to, well, it has in it a DigiDesign digital music card, which allows you to do direct-to-disc recording, and that's connected up to a 1,200 megabyte drive, which is nearly full of content. And essentially what I've done is when I recorded the songs, I broke them up into a lot of little sort of modular building blocks. First thing I did was I had to be conscious when I was writing this music that it was going to be divided in certain places. And the most crucial point in any interactive presentation is the point in which things are glued together. It's not actually within the actual piece of content, but the places where the fragments get glued together is the most important point. So you had to be conscious of that when writing and recording the music to see that those things would glue together properly. And then the next thing I did was, and I have to admit that this is a relatively crude approach designed to take advantage of what's available now. And in the future, you may be able to do this in a much more sophisticated way. But for what's available now, essentially what I did was, whenever I mixed a song, I would mix it, let's say, 5 different ways. I would add or delete instruments that would give it a different dynamic depending on which version you were listening to. And I can demonstrate how that works here if I can find the menu. There it is. This is the hard drive, and I've sort of given each of the sort of musical fragments. There are 7 of them, plus a little, I've got a folder full of sort of wildcard bits that can be used in between as transitional elements. But let's say, for instance, this song, and I don't know which one it is. I'm not sure why I don't see anything in it. Oh, hold on, I know what's wrong. You can see each one of these little fragments has some kind of a code number to it, and I'll explain what it is. This is just my personal system. There may be other ways of doing it. I arbitrarily numbered the songs, like S1 is song number 1, S2 be song number 2. So I've got a little song here called S1, and C1 means chorus, what would traditionally be the chorus of the song. Now the difference is when you're recording this is, since it's a space that you inhabit, you don't necessarily write songs the way you usually did, which is verse, chorus, bridge, chorus out, or some form like that, which is the way most people write songs. Since you inhabit the space, it's totally possible for someone to decide they like the verse better than the rest of the song, and they just want to hang in the verse for a while. So you might discover yourself writing 12 verses. And this is where the so-called extensibility comes in. When sometime 10, 15 years from now, record stores disappear, and you get all of your content down a fiber optic line that comes directly into your home, suddenly you can wake up one morning and decide, oh, I think I want to add a verse to that song. So you can add a verse to the database, and then anyone who has been listening to your music can download it into their home and suddenly have another verse to listen to when they hang out in the verse part of the song. So I've got C1 stands for choruses, and the D, it says D1 after that, that stands for a dynamic level. In other words, usually D1 means it's everything in like normal mix or kind of like balls to the wall part of it. Every possible instrument is in there. And then various dynamic levels, kind of as the numbers go up, the dynamics go down. Instruments begin to disappear, and even at some dynamic levels, there's no vocals. So you can listen to just the track if you want. If you decide you don't like the singing at all, you can listen to only the track. And I can give you a little sort of indication here of of the difference. I'm not sure which song this is, but we can play it. Get what you ain't got to get. Lord have mercy on me. Drinking up blood and sweat and tears. I ain't afraid to just give it to me. That was a musical building block right there at the maximum dynamic level. Now we can remove some of the at some at dynamic level too. Here's get what you ain't got to get. Lord have mercy on me. Drinking up blood and sweat. And then we have essentially the same piece of music without any vocals on it. So let's say someone wants to cruise through this particular piece of music in a dynamic vector. In other words, since you can look at music no longer as being linear, it's a volume. So imagine yourself as a listener being a goldfish in a big fish tank. And all you have to do is, my personal beliefs about the way that people will actually interact with things is not the way people who, for instance, design video games think of it. If you're running a video game, it's like driving a car or flying a jet plane or something like that. You got your hands on the controls the whole time, and you're always doing something. My personal feeling is that when people are being entertained or engaged in listening to some piece of art or something, then what they will really be doing is something more like watching the television with a remote control in their hand. And you'll go along, playing along essentially with what's on the screen until you get bored, and then you'll hit the channel control, like channel up or channel down, until you get to something else that catches your interest. And then you'll watch that for a while. When you get bored with that, you'll move on to something else. And so in that sense, it should only take a little bit of input from the user to set them off on a vector. And the vectors can be anything that you want to define as an artist. I personally define them, let's say 3 of them are a movement through song space. In other words, you go through songs that in more or less the traditional form, verses and choruses and bridges and things like that, and then it moves on to the next song. Then you could also move through it in lyrical space. You could stay in the same section of the song, let's say the verse or the chorus, and have different verses happen, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, eventually looping around again to the first one or happening at random, something like that. And then also it's possible, let's say, to move through dynamic space. In other words, you're listening to the same verse over and over, but as it plays, just in the way that I demonstrated in the chorus, various things start to pop in and out as it repeats itself. And then you can have combinations of these vectors. You're moving in lyrical space, you're moving in dynamic space, you're moving in song space. There may be other spaces that you can move in, arbitrarily selected, because you're still in control as an artist in terms of how far people can go in any of these particular directions. So just to demonstrate how I sort of put one of these things together, I can select some pieces at random. Let's at least start out with like an intro. Let's just select intro 1 at the 3rd dynamic level, and we'll select that. And then we'll maybe, we got an intro 3, and we'll do that at sort of dynamic level 1. This is a program, by the way. I don't know if I bother to point this out. This is a program called Masterlist. It was a dinky little program that nobody was really interested in, but what it allows you to do is to put together a series of these randomly selected musical bits and play them seamlessly. In other words, there's no gaps in between the sound. So let's select another one. Let's say we throw in a what else have I got here? Let's throw in a verse. Verse 4 at dynamic level 2. And maybe, let's pick verse 2 at dynamic level 1. And, we'll just play this little bit here. This can be considered sort of a random navigation through this particular song space.
vision and act upon it while I still got volition. But I got so many ideas in collision, it makes it hard to be a man with a mission. The truth is always wherever you find it. Throw back the curtain, see what's behind it. Look hard at life and the ties that bind it. Day after day we must be reminded.
So you might notice that I selected verse 4 and placed it in front of verse 2. This is a particular problem that you have to confront head on if you're going to do this kind of music, which is what would happen in a normal song if we just cut it somewhere in the middle and swap the pieces around? Would the lyrics mean anything any longer? And the idea is that you have to complete an idea within this musical fragment. The disadvantage is that you can't create these kind of like long ambling things, that will always start at one hypothesis and end at this particular conclusion. But the advantage is that as you navigate through these lyrical spaces, the meaning isn't always the same. The meaning is the result of the juxtaposition of these fragmentary ideas. And at this point, there may be some degree of simplicity or crudeness to it, but I think as the technology advances and also as the artistic philosophy advances, that a great deal of sophistication can be introduced into this, almost a sort of classicism like haiku poetry or something like that. And fortunately, a lot of contemporary music lends itself to this. Particularly, as you'll notice, sort of like a rap form or something like that, where it isn't necessarily a very long, it isn't like a story, that has to have a beginning and an end to it. It's really a series of positions, a series of what in some Hindu philosophy or something like that might be considered a mystical pose, or I don't know. There are probably other ways to express this, but one of the challenges of this, which you don't experience in quote everyday music, is that you have to be able to have things make a certain kind of sense no matter how you put them together. And that's the challenge. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play what is more or less just an experimental pass at the database, the volume of music that's going to make up the next album that comes out. And what you might want to do, if you can see this clearly enough, is follow along as the different little musical bits get played. Then you might want at some point to ignore this display and just see whether it succeeds as music in a non-interactive format, but consider that this is a more or less ordered navigation through a volume. And sometimes it'll be very orderly. In other words, it'll sound very much like a conventional song. And then sometimes it's going to be very, let's not say disorderly, but a lot more sort of less conventional. Something resembling more what a live DJ might come up with if he was mixing in a club. And that you, as a user, would have the opportunity to do this had you the proper device.
Let me job. Don't quit your day job. Don't quit your day job. Don't quit your day job. Corporate crybaby, I've been wiser and a whole lot older. Feeling bolder, sucking up to the last stockholder with a golden parachute slung over your shoulder. Jacked up B-boy, another fool got stuck in the whirlpool. Looking for a fast break, not enough cake to go round. Another brother goes down and he's out of the gene pool. He a pimp, day after day, night after night. If the money is right, you can't believe it's hard to make right seem wrong. With computer animation and a hip-hop song. Land of opportunity, this is a land of opportunity. This is a land of opportunity. Don't quit your day job. 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 Reach to the airwaves, let the buyer beware. It's a jungle out there, so by my advice, don't think twice. Then me and your money will go someplace sunny. Cowboy politicians sucking up to the aristocracy. Not even sure if you like democracy. Trying to establish an American royalty, a personal dynasty. Celebrity stud monkey, kiss and tell. Got a book to sell, cause you don't excel or do anything well. Since you slip past 30, better keep the sex dirty. Land of opportunity, more money, more money, more money, more money, more money, more money. This is a land of opportunity, more money, more money. Don't quit your day job. Don't quit your day job. Since God began it, we've been dividing up the planet. When you see something you want it, you got to put your name tag on it. Can we go on robbing while half the world is starving? It's a crime. Hands off of his mind.
I'm not going to play the whole thing because it goes on for about 30 minutes, but I might jump ahead a little bit to where it gets a little more wacky to give you the idea. Also, I wanted to, someone pointed out that I may not have made clear exactly how how the average person would experience this. And once again, there's a device that's going to be available. That is available now. There isn't a lot of software for it, but when Sony gets into the picture later in the year, there'll be a lot of big hype around it for the Christmas season, and it's called a CDI player. And they'll cost anywhere from, ultimately they'll probably cost around $200 or $300. Right now they cost about $500 at Radio Shack for a Memorex model, and then Sony's model will be anywhere from say $1,000 to $500. The latest models, when they come out, will be able to display full motion video as well as CD quality sound and 3 levels of sound compression as well. Most likely, you, as an artist, you'll be taking advantage of the first level of sound compression, which is nearly as good as CD quality, but doubles the amount of available space to create your musical environment in. The other thing I wanted to point out, just an interesting aside that has to do with the issues of sampling, and I suppose I might be in a unique position having made records for 20 years, but I've overcome the sampling licensing problem by only sampling my own records. So people may want to actually, overcome that thing by recording the thing that they want to sample, and then you only have to pay publishing license on it. You don't have to acquire a performance license. In other words, if you wanted to use Led Zeppelin, then you would have to go into the studio and do your own imitation of Led Zeppelin and sample that and then stick it in your record. Let's see if we can find a wacky place here. Say somewhere around here. I want to have a little bit of Q&A at the end, so. Let's go to. That's enough for now. Well, if you like that, you should hear it with both sides of the stereo. You know, we kind of threw this together a little quick. I want to open the floor now to a little Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer the questions. And ideally, this will all have to do only with what I've been talking about this afternoon and not the whereabouts of the NAS. Thank you. Aw, damn.
CDI has a visual component too, which you haven't really addressed with this. This particular piece of software.
You're right. Well, this particular piece of software is only development to test out various things in a non-interactive format. As far as the visual component goes, my concern right now is interactive music. CDI's bandwidth is limited by the rate at which you can get stuff off of the disk. Now, there is a possibility that some visual component can be added to it, but I'm not trying to do the whole ball of wax at once. And the most important part right now, I think, is trying to get interactive music to work as a viable format.
Essentially, then, what you're turning people into is remixers.
It's, you can consider it, you can call it anything you want. Right now, it's essentially a bunch of pre-mixed components, but as the technology advances, as the devices get, for instance, the ability to download samples and act as sampling devices of their own, music can be completely resynthesized from the original events that created it. In other words, you no longer record the sound of the instruments, you record the events of playing the instruments and have them compressed and encoded, and then the user would be able to do things like, for instance, move closer to a particular instrument, to change the sound of a particular instrument, or to even change the style in which an instrument's played.
Did breaking down the songs to 10 to 20-second bites have any effect on your creativity currently in the project?
I thought it would have when I first started, but if you accept that that's one of the ground rules, then eventually you get into a working thing where you don't think about it that much. You just accept those particular ground rules, proceed from there, and see what you can get out of it.
I'd love to ask you about the video paint box, but I think if I did, I'd get mugged.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to get back to the point you were making earlier about basically when there are no record stores, if you get a national fiber optic network, which I agree at this point seems sort of inevitable, it gets to the point where you can download someone's music directly from a network.
Right.
My question is just if you've given any thought to the way this will shape the industry. Because basically when distribution networks as they exist now are no longer part of the record industry, I guess in an ideal situation, it brings the artist that much closer to the person who's listening to the music. But I guess I'm too realistic to think that record companies will really let that happen.
Well, I don't think that, there are certainly legalities to be worked out, but it'll be the same players as now. It'll be Tower Records, and it'll be Blockbuster Video, except they won't have storefronts. They'll just have big faceless buildings with giant mainframe computers in them, waiting for you to call up, and then they'll download it to your house, and then they'll charge you for it just as if you had walked into the record store to buy it. The difference is that pre-recorded medium will disappear. In other words, you won't ever go out and buy a pre-recorded CD. All you do is buy blank media, stick it into what will eventually be, something like this, except with a computer inside it, and say, okay, I want this particular record. I want these songs off of this record, or I want this particular. I want to buy 6 pounds of Michael Jackson, and they'll just download it to you, and it'll appear on, what may be sort of like an MD, like mini disc or something like that. You can listen to it at home. You can pop it into a portable player and take it with you, or listen to it in your car. It's just the delivery medium will be different. It'll be much more efficient, I think, because they won't have to send the records to a pressing plant to be pressed and then sent to a record store to be boxed. Throw away all the packaging that you throw away and stuff like that. That'll all disappear.
But my main question was, given you're throwing away all that stuff, it seems like there'd be great savings, and in that way, the artist could get, records would cost less, and the artist would get more of actually what people were buying. But that seems.
Well, I think that's ideal. I think also the hidden thing is that there'll be a lot of public channels where people who aren't traditionally musicians or haven't signed a record deal with somebody. In other words, they don't have a company bankrolling the making of the record. the cost of equipment is coming down further and further. You get yourself an ADAT, and a couple of synthesizers, make your own records, and completely do an end run around the record companies altogether. Go directly to some kind of equivalent of public access on the data uplink.
But what about the average person? I think it's great that someone had a program like VCR.
Well, that's why I believe that navigation methods will ultimately be very much like just running the remote control for your television. It's things will go along sort of on autopilot until you decide you want to jog it a certain way, and essentially the vector will change, but it's not up to you to stand on the gas the whole time. All you have to do is at certain points say, okay, I want to go off in this direction, I want to go this fast in that direction, and that's essentially all you'll have to do, and just kick back and get into it. Oh, that's yours.
When the technology eventually evolves to this point that we're talking about, how do you foresee it affecting radio and nightclubs?
Well, I think that nightclubs essentially are more leading edge in these issues than radio is, and I think there's a possibility that radio, as we know it, will sort of mutate severely or disappear altogether. Now, there's certain cable systems in the country where you can get like 70 channels of CD quality music coming over a special box that adds onto your cable system, and they're completely verticalized. In other words, you say the only thing I'm interested in is in modern jazz, and you can get all day long with no talk, just one song after another of modern jazz. And not only that, it'll do the things that radio neglects to do, which is give you a readout of exactly who the artist is and what record the cut is on, things like that. So, which is always a problem. You hear something you like, and of course it's the middle of a 2-hour block of non-stop tunes, and so you've got to listen to all this direct to find out which one it was, and you can't remember whether it was the 5th one back or the 6th one back, and all of this business. So there's certainly a broadening of the way that music will be delivered into the home even now, and in the next 5-10 years, I think radio stations are going to continue their sort of downward slide, and the thing that they'll be good for is what they were originally good for, which is bringing you live events, events that are not part of a database but being created extemporaneously.
I am actually currently in the nightclub business. I was more interested in how you foresee it affecting, or how you foresee it integrating into that business.
Well, my personal feeling is that if I release this as an interactive record, it's more likely to appear in a club than in somebody's home. That a DJ will just go out and get himself a player, and if there are more records like this, more than just me, but other artists, which we hope to develop, that they will simply pop the thing in there and sort of navigate it in the same way you would at home, but keep it within a certain range. They'll make themselves familiar with the content in the same way that they review the records and decide which records to mix together, and essentially navigate around a certain kind of range, germane to the kind of feeling they want to create, whether it's a dancey thing or a ravey thing or a dreamy thing or whatever.
Thanks for coming down today. I'm sure we all appreciate it.
Thank you.
I have a question about, actually a couple questions, about when you say discs, are you using CD-ROM technology to store the information, or is it just a large hard disk?
Right now it's a big hard disk. It could conceivably be stored on CD-ROM, except you can't play directly. You can't play CD quality sound directly off a CD-ROM right now. CD-ROM players normally play either CDs or they play CD-ROMs. CDs, they have special hardware in there to get the sound off and out the audio ports in real time. But it's impossible to get CD quality sound off of a CD into a computer and out the speakers in real time, because it's going through all these kind of like steps of converting it from computer data back into audio data.
Which leads me to my next question. Your voice sounded great, not that I'm surprised, but I was wondering if when you're recording acoustic signals like the human voice on your computer, if it raises any special problems, or if you use any special hardware to enable, if you want to record acoustic drums.
Well, this wasn't recorded on the computer. It was recorded onto tape and then mixed. I would essentially do what was the normal recording process. Of course, at some point there won't be any such thing as tape machines. We'll be doing everything solid state, but for now I did everything on tape in a more or less conventional manner, and just essentially mixed the songs did 4 or 5 versions of the mixes onto DAT tape, and then did direct-to-disc recording from the DAT to the hard disk, and using tools that came with this, cut it up into the little pieces, that essentially make up the content base. No problem.
Yeah, I was wondering on the computer effects, like the 3D things. I know on high-end Mac, it can take 20 hours. Doesn't do real-time rendering. Do you use 3 computers and then sit there for 20 hours?
Well, if you're talking about the original video,
Yeah.
it took almost 4 weeks to render using 10
10 computers.
video toasters.
The average guy, I mean, I know when I do this, tries something Spark, and 20 hours later.
Well, I can divulge that if you use a certain system, and I'll give you the details after the Q&A is over. If you're using a certain system, there's going to be the equivalent of a photo mat to get your stuff rendered. You can design it at home on one computer, and then essentially send a database off someplace to be rendered.
To a Sun.
What?
Using a Sun computer.
You're using Sun?
No, I mean for real-time rendering.
No, I haven't used the Sun. I've used SGI machines and Video Toaster, which runs in the Amiga, and I don't want to get into the Amiga right now, and various other systems, but essentially it is possible with a big enough computer to do it in real time, but ultimately what you want is videotape, something like that. You'll be able to design it and send it off and get videotape back as if you were sending your pictures off the photo mat.
And this is more interactive for the artist and the consumer. Like, I look at this as being like clip music, clip art. The guy goes to one section and played and put an intro, played images. Then the consumer can interact with the arguments that runs this.
Well, in this particular thing, as I said, there are still weak points in the technology, and the weakest point right now is graphics throughput. Graphics uses up a lot of gigabytes of stuff. Sound uses up a lot, but they have a methodology for getting throughput on that. For video, it's much more difficult to compress and broadcast, and so it's going to be a little while before you can get that kind of interactivity.
4 or 5 years.
Maybe, who knows? It may be sooner than that, but it's going to be a while.
Do you have any, or can you recommend any literature on this?
As a matter of fact, I went down to McGraw-Hill bookstore and tried to get a book on CDI, and they didn't have a single one in stock. You can get a CDI development system for anywhere from about $7,000 to $15,000, and that essentially is a CDI player with a specialized operating system, so that you can do development on it, and a big hard disk and a bunch of conversion utilities. And you develop your content, let's say on a Macintosh or an IBM. You use these conversion utilities to get it over into CDI format, and you can do all your development on a CDI machine. Once you have it done, you send essentially the hard drive away to be converted into a CDI disk. So the hardware system is available. It's not too dear. It's about $15,000. It's like a high-end personal computer, and that's actually, I don't have that system here, but that's the system that we'll ultimately be doing the development on.
Okay, and can you see this affecting tooling as well?
As a matter of fact, I didn't get into what essentially is the open aspect, which is the performance aspect of interactivity. And there's a project that I'm working on that I can't go into too many details about right now, which is going to address this aspect, essentially how interactivity works in live performance. And by the end of the year, we'll be publicizing that and stuff. So. We have to sort of, we've been asked to cut short here, but if anybody wants to ask me questions here while they're sort of changing things around, I can answer some questions here. So let's make this the last question and then on.
We have a full-blown of a video toaster, and we've been doing some great things with editing. A lot of MTV quality has come out of it, hooked up with Beta. There's like virtually nothing to help people who have a full-blown system and want to use the animation. What do you suggest?
I had advantages that most people don't, in that I had been working in video and computer graphics for about 10 or 15 years before I laid hands on the video toaster. So what I did is not something that anybody can just like pick up the toaster and do. There are a lot of basic concepts that you have to be acquainted with. There are books about video graphics and what it takes to work in that particular medium, but it's not simple. It's
Definitely not.
it's filmmaking essentially. You know, it's not. It can be more cost effective than, for instance, hiring a film crew and going out and doing a bunch of stuff like that. But there are things that are and aren't possible, and also you have to know about lighting. You have to know about what the cameraman has to know and focal lengths and all this other stuff. It's just like making movies, except you do it in a computer, instead of in the real world, as it were. It's virtual filmmaking.
Last question. We promised not to ask about NAS, but what about Utopia?
Utopia just did a 2-week tour in Japan because they asked us to, and there's a possibility that we'll be doing something, but everyone's got other things that they're working on, and we don't really intend to rush it. So there's possibilities that there'll be Utopia projects, but I can't really give you anything concrete right now. In any case, thanks a lot for showing up at this ungodly hour.